Close your eyes for a moment and picture the sound of a ticking clock. With every beat, France's national debt climbs another 5,000 euros. That's 300,000 euros every single minute, 18 million euros every hour, nearly $500 million added to the tab in a single day. Today, France is drowning under a mountain of more than 3.8 trillion euros, with yearly interest payments alone eating over 60 billion euros money that could fund the entire economy of several smaller nations. And yet, while ordinary French citizens see their pensions frozen, hospitals cut back, and even national holidays threaten, the privileged political class still enjoy six-figure salaries and lavish benefits. The people protest in the streets, strikes shut down trains and schools, but the government responds with more austerity. This isn't a shortage of wealth, it's a crisis of priorities. Now let us turn the lens across the Mediterranean. In Africa, a very different story is unfolding. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has stood firm against the same France that once dictated his nation's fate. He expelled foreign troops, tore up lopsided mining contracts, and redirected resources toward agriculture, industry, and national defense. In Niger, President Abdourahmane Tiani forced out the French uranium giant Orano, and in just 1 year, electricity access soared from 15% to more than 70%. These are not the actions of weak states begging for aid. These are nations standing tall, showing that Africa can lead, build, and prosper without colonial shadows. So the question becomes, are we witnessing the slow collapse of an old empire and the unmistakable rise of a continent once written off? Can Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré truly become the model of post-colonial leadership that inspires the rest of Africa? And should France be given another chance? Or is it time to close the book on centuries of painful history once and for all? If you care about Africa reclaiming its voice, its resources, and its destiny, this is your call to action. Please share this story if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines, and subscribe so we can write the next chapter together. The numbers are staggering, almost unbelievable, yet they define the daily reality of France's economic collapse. Every passing second, an invisible counter adds another €5,000 to the national debt. By the time you've finished watching this video, millions more will have been added to a tab that already exceeds 3.8 trillion euros. For the French people, the consequences are painfully visible. Pensions frozen, healthcare slashed, and even sacred national holidays threatened in a desperate attempt to scrape together a few billion more. Consider this: the French government has openly debated canceling Easter Monday and Victory Day, forcing citizens to work additional days in hopes of raising 4.5 billion euros. To ordinary people, that sacrifice is enormous. To a government drowning in trillions of debt, it's a drop in the ocean. Meanwhile, strikes erupt across the nation. Train stations are paralyzed, schools shuttered, and hospitals strained beyond capacity. France's leaders tell their citizens to tighten belts, yet the elite enjoy untouchable privileges, six-figure salaries, 54 days of vacation, and perks paid directly from the public treasury. This contrast, suffering for the majority, comfort for the few, has left France in a state of moral and political crisis. And as its leaders struggle to maintain control at home, they look outward across the Mediterranean to the lands they once dominated. The irony is almost poetic. For centuries, Africa was treated as France's financial reservoir. Gold, uranium, cotton oil resources flowed north while exploitation and poverty remained behind. But today, that script is being flipped. In Burkina Faso, a nation once dismissed as a failed state, the tide began to turn in 2022. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré assumed leadership, he sent a clear message to Paris and to the world: Burkina Faso would no longer be anyone's colony in disguise. French troops once stationed on Burkinabe soil under the banner of counterterrorism were ordered to leave. Foreign contracts that siphoned national wealth abroad were torn apart. Instead, Traoré directed resources toward domestic strength, agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and most importantly, security forces commanded and equipped by their own people. This wasn't symbolism, it was survival. By reclaiming control, Burkina Faso transformed vulnerability into resilience. Agricultural programs were launched to ensure food independence, reducing reliance on foreign imports. Investments were poured into local industries, sparking employment and keeping profits inside the country rather than flowing back to Paris. Soldiers, once dependent on training and weapons supplied by outsiders, were rearmed and retrained under Burkinabe command, restoring confidence in their ability to defend their own land. For ordinary citizens, the impact could be felt in everyday life. Farmers gained access to support programs that encouraged food production. Mining profits, instead of disappearing into foreign accounts, began to trickle back into local development projects. Pride returned to the streets of Ouagadougou and the villages beyond. A people long told that they were weak began to see proof that strength was possible. And while France scrambled to patch holes in its sinking economic ship, Burkina Faso walked into negotiations not as a client state but as an equal partner, or when terms weren't fair, chose to walk away altogether. That stance alone sent shockwaves across Africa. It said loudly and clearly that aid dependency was not destiny and that sovereignty was more than a slogan. This contrast could not be sharper. In Paris, lawmakers debate how to shave billions off health budgets while maintaining luxury for officials. In Ouagadougou, leaders redirect resources into schools, farms, and defense. One society is fraying under the weight of decades of debt and entitlement. The other, once written off, is stitching itself together with newfound conviction. The story of this chapter is clear. France is crumbling under its own contradictions, while Burkina Faso is rising by relying on its people. And that rise, fueled by Captain Ibrahim Traoré's defiance, is beginning to inspire a continent that has watched too long from the sidelines. If Burkina Faso lit the first spark, then Niger struck the lightning bolt that shook France to its core. For decades, uranium from Niger fueled French nuclear power plants, providing nearly 70% of the nation's electricity. The deal on paper was already unfair. France's mining giant Orano, once called Areva, held the right to extract 63% of Niger's uranium. In practice, it was worse. France walked away with 86% of the resource, paying next to nothing. The humiliating reality: Niger earned just 86 cents for every kilogram of uranium, even as that same uranium sold for over $200 on global markets. This wasn't trade. It was theft dressed up as partnership, and the people of Niger knew it. When President Abdourahmane Tiani came to power, he did what generations of leaders had hesitated to attempt. He called France's bluff. Orano was given a choice: renegotiate with fair terms or leave. The company refused. In response, Tiani canceled their license outright, ordering them out of the country. For France, it was a thunderclap. Uranium had been the hidden lifeline of its energy system, and suddenly that artery was severed. France rushed to international courts, seeking to force Niger's hand. But unlike in the past, Niger didn't flinch. It stood firm. And then came the shockwave. Within 1 year of reclaiming control, Niger used its uranium revenues to transform its own infrastructure. Electricity access, which had stagnated around 15% for decades, surged to over 70%. Villages that had never seen a light bulb suddenly had power. Schools extended study hours into the evening. Clinics operated refrigerators for medicine and vaccines. For the first time, Niger's natural wealth was feeding its people, not a foreign treasury. This was more than an economic victory. It was a psychological revolution. Across Africa, citizens looked at Niger's boldness and saw a blueprint. If Niger could reclaim uranium, what about countries with gold, oil, or rare earth metals? If France could be pushed back in one corner, perhaps it could be pushed back everywhere. The reaction across the continent was electric. In Mali, voices in government called for reviewing old mining contracts. In Burkina Faso, Traoré doubled down on efforts to nationalize resources, pointing to Niger as proof that sovereignty wasn't just symbolic, it paid off. In Ghana, Nigeria, and even South Africa, journalists and civil society organizations began to ask uncomfortable questions: how much of our national wealth is leaving under the guise of partnerships? Meanwhile, in France, the fallout was immediate. Energy companies warned of rising costs. Politicians in Paris scrambled to assure the public that power supplies were stable. The media, once dismissive of African grievances, began to speak of the end of France-Afrique, the colonial-era system of dominance that Paris had relied upon for so long. Macron himself softened his tone, calling for cooperation based on respect, a phrase that only underscored how desperate France had become. But for African leaders like Tiani and Traoré, the message was clear. France's outreach was not charity, it was survival. They understood that the old empire was wobbling, that the balance of power had shifted, and for the first time they held the cards. The climax of this struggle is not just in contracts and courtrooms, it is in the streets. In Niamey, crowds cheered as French soldiers packed their bags. In Ouagadougou, young people painted murals of Traoré standing beside the Burkinabe flag, a symbol of defiance. These were not empty gestures. They were declarations broadcast across the continent, and beyond that, Africa would no longer be dictated to. The question that now lingers is whether France and by extension the West truly understands what has changed. Because Niger's uranium uprising wasn't just about one resource, it was the turning of a page. The climax of a long story where Africa, once plundered and silenced, now speaks with a voice too loud to ignore. The consequences of this dramatic shift ripple far beyond policy papers and government halls. They are written in the daily lives of ordinary people, in the frustration of French citizens, and in the cautious pride of Africans reclaiming their sovereignty. In France, the social contract is unraveling. Pensioners who worked their whole lives are told their retirements will shrink. Hospitals are ordered to cut budgets by billions, forcing longer waiting lists, staff shortages, and entire wards closing. Parents watch schools shut their doors during strikes, and workers see trains grind to a halt as transport unions rage against austerity. The mood on the streets is one of exhaustion mixed with fury. Citizens know their sacrifices are not saving the nation, only preserving the comfort of a political class insulated from the very crisis they created. The image of elites enjoying €121,000 salaries and 54 vacation days while the average French household struggles has become a symbol of betrayal. France is not bankrupt of money, but of trust. On the other side of the Mediterranean, the story unfolds differently. In Burkina Faso, every reform under Captain Ibrahim Traoré has carried immediate tangible meaning for civil society. Farmers in rural villages are no longer waiting for foreign shipments of food aid, they are receiving state support to grow and sell their own crops. Young people once skeptical of politics are rallying behind the vision of self-reliance, joining civic programs, and volunteering in community defense units. For many, the feeling is not just survival, but dignity restored. In Niger, the uranium revolution has changed lives overnight. When electricity access jumped from 15% to over 70%, entire communities experienced a leap forward in living standards. Children studied under electric lights for the first time. Clinics kept medicine refrigerated and ran equipment that once sat idle. Small businesses, from sewing shops to phone charging kiosks, flourished with stable power. Citizens began to believe that their government, for once, was acting in their interest. These shifts also reshaped politics. Leaders who once survived by clinging to French patronage now face a new reality. Their people have seen alternatives. They have witnessed that rejecting foreign exploitation is not suicide, but empowerment. The political cost of submission is rising, while the rewards of independence are clearer than ever. Yet there are risks. In both Burkina Faso and Niger, the struggle for sovereignty has come with increased tensions. France's departure created security gaps that had to be filled quickly. Traoré's push for nationalized industries demands competent management, something that has been historically undermined by corruption and weak institutions. In Niger, the loss of French protection provoked fears of retaliation both from terrorist groups and from powerful lobbies in Paris and Brussels. Still, the broader civil and political effect is undeniable. Africans are beginning to expect more from their leaders. Citizens are demanding transparency in resource contracts, investment in schools and hospitals, and policies that prioritize the public over elites. What began as a confrontation with France has become a deeper transformation of political culture. Meanwhile, in France itself, the opposite is true. Citizens no longer believe their leaders are capable of reform. Trust is eroding, protests are escalating, and politics are polarizing. Where Africa is learning to rise on its own terms, France is learning what it feels like to stumble under its own contradictions. The civil and political consequences form a mirror image. One society descending into cynicism, the other climbing toward hope. And it is within this contrast that the story of our age is being written: the decline of the old empire and the awakening of those it once ruled. When France stumbled, the world took notice, and nowhere was the reaction more complex than in Washington, Brussels, Moscow, and Beijing. The collapse of French influence in Africa is not an isolated event. It is a reshuffling of the global order with ripple effects that stretch far beyond the Sahel. For the United States, the situation presents both an opportunity and a dilemma. On one hand, Washington has long been wary of France's outsized role in its former colonies. The erosion of France-Afrique could, in theory, open space for new partnerships built on trade and security. Yet, U.S. policymakers also see danger. The rapid rise of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré and Abdurrahman Tiani, who reject Western dictates and align more readily with Russia or China, signals a shifting tide. America's own strategy in Africa promoting stability while safeguarding access to critical minerals suddenly feels outdated. The question in Washington's think tanks is blunt: will Africa's new sovereignty close the door to U.S. influence altogether? Europe, meanwhile, is split. Germany and Italy quietly push for pragmatic deals with African states, recognizing that their industries need Africa's resources. But in Paris, the tone is defensive, almost desperate. Macron's government frames its outreach as renewed partnership, but Africans see it for what it is: an empire in retreat begging for relevance. The European Union as a whole now faces the uncomfortable reality that Africa, once viewed as a periphery, is fast becoming central to the future of global energy and supply chains. Russia has moved quickly to fill the vacuum. Wagner fighters, though controversial, have secured footholds in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, offering immediate security support where Western promises have failed. Moscow presents itself as the reliable ally who respects sovereignty and delivers results without lectures. Whether or not that perception holds long-term, it resonates powerfully in a continent weary of Western hypocrisy. China, too, has positioned itself as a partner of choice. Through infrastructure loans, technology transfers, and mining investments, Beijing is embedding itself deeply in African economies. To African leaders, Chinese involvement feels less paternalistic, even if it comes with heavy debt risks. What matters is that the Chinese arrive without the colonial baggage that still haunts Europe. The international media, from Washington Post to Al Jazeera, has framed the story in dramatic terms: the end of France-Afrique, Africa's new dawn, the fall of an empire. Analysts warn that what happens in Burkina Faso and Niger may foreshadow broader upheavals across the continent. If uranium can be reclaimed, why not oil in Nigeria, gold in Ghana, or cobalt in Congo? For older Americans watching this from afar, the parallels may feel familiar. Just as the British Empire crumbled after World War II, France is discovering that no empire lasts forever. The difference today is that African nations are not waiting passively for outside powers to dictate their futures. They are driving the change themselves, with leaders like Ibrahim Traoré insisting on dignity, equality, and self-reliance. The world is beginning to accept a new truth: Africa is no longer a pawn in someone else's game. It is a player at the table holding cards the rest of the world desperately needs. And that realization is what truly terrifies the old powers. The story of France and Africa is no longer one of master and servant. It is a story of reversal. The colonizer bowed, the colonized standing tall. France, once the shining symbol of European wealth, now wrestles with a debt spiral that drains its spirit and fractures its society. Burkina Faso and Niger, once dismissed as dependent states, now show the world what sovereignty looks like when it is lived, not just spoken. But let us be clear, this is not the end of the struggle. History warns us that empires do not surrender quietly. Economic collapse in France could fuel desperation, leading Paris and its allies to redouble their efforts to cling to influence through covert operations, sanctions, or manipulation of global courts. The more Africa rises, the more those who once profited from its weakness will seek ways to push it back down. That is why this moment requires vigilance as much as it requires pride. For civil society, the responsibility is heavy but clear. Citizens must hold their leaders accountable so that sovereignty does not decay into corruption. Youth must rise with the energy to protect reforms, while elders provide wisdom to steer the course. Without vigilance, victories risk being temporary. With vigilance, they can define a century. And for those of us watching from across the Atlantic in the United States, Canada, or Europe, the message is sobering. We are witnessing the close of one chapter and the fragile beginning of another. The question is not just whether France will change, but whether the world will learn to respect Africa on equal terms. Can the United States treat African nations as partners rather than pawns? Can Europe abandon paternalism for true cooperation? Or will old habits prevail, driving Africa to close its doors for good? For Africa, the choice is equally profound. Should the continent extend a cautious hand to France one more time, demanding fairness and dignity? Or should it build entirely new alliances, leaving behind the ghosts of empire? Perhaps the most radical choice of all is the third option: to look inward, to invest in African unity and self-reliance, and to create a future written entirely by Africans for Africans. And so I leave you with this. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies are strong enough to carry this vision forward, or will the mantle of leadership need to pass to someone else to complete the work? If you believe this turning point matters, then stand with us. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Together, we can ensure that this time history is not written by the empire that falls, but by the continent that rises.